Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men. Hello again, and welcome to the Truth in My Days Apologetics podcast with John Torse. Hello, John. How are you today?
Fine, thanks.
Good. So, the other day, we looked at prophecies in the Bible as evidence that Bible is really from God.
Yes, as you recall, we pointed out that if God wants us to communicate with us by means of a book, and he knows that there's so many books out there purporting to be from him, it stands to reason that God would show which one was truly from him. He would authenticate his book.
Right. Now, I said that what I'd want to see in a book to indicate it was truly from God, I'd want to see things that no human could have come up with on his own, without divine help.
Right, and we looked at the fact that people cannot foretell the future, not in detail, not far in advance, especially if it's not expected. So that's what we call predictive prophecy, where the future is foretold in these ways. And since people can't do that, that's why predictive prophecy is such a good indication of divine authorship.
Is there something else?
There's another category of such phenomena, something that I call advanced knowledge or advanced scientific knowledge.
What do you mean by that?
There's things in the Bible, certain things that when we read it, we don't give it a second thought because they're so obvious to us. But if we did stop and think, we'd realize that these are things that we now know because we've developed various scientific tools such as advanced telescopes that have allowed us to discover these things. And we don't realize that no one could have known about it before these tools were invented.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Do you have an example of this?
Sure. Consider the question of what the Earth rests on, for example. Of course, we know the Earth hangs in space. We know it's suspended on nothing. And since it is so well known to us that we don't stop. If we see such a thing in the Bible, we don't stop to wonder how people could have known at the time that Job was written, or in fact, whether they knew it at all. And in fact, they didn't know it. They couldn't know it. How could they? The concept of a solid piece of matter floating on nothing, it's not only not a given, it's actually counterintuitive. The law of gravity sums up what we observe everywhere around us. That is, that solid objects don't float on nothing. They always fall down. You hold up a pen, let it go, it'll fall. Hold up a tennis ball, let it go, it'll fall. They always fall. Always. So no wonder then that Job, talking about the book of Job in the Old Testament, and no wonder that Job's contemporaries all thought that the earth must be resting on something. It couldn't just be hanging there in space. They thought it had to be supported by something, whether it was on water, or on solid pillars, or on Atlas's shoulders, or on the backs of 4 giant elephants, standing on the back of an even bigger sea turtle swimming in an infinite sea of milk, just the ancient Indian view. The idea then that God hangs the earth on nothing was simply not within their scope of imagination, which is why nobody at the time thought that. And yet there it is in the Bible, and it was a long time before that we found out that it is actually correct.
Wow.
We see, if you look at Job chapter 26, we see in verse 7, he stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. He hangs the earth on nothing. How did the writer know that centuries before science discovered it? How did he know unless this was actually inspired by God? And then we move on. We look at verse 10 in the same chapter, Job 26, which says, he drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. Think about that. A circular horizon on the face of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. Now, if you look at Earth from space, you will see exactly that. Most of the surface of the Earth you will see is water, and the Earth is light compared to the space around it. Like the moon, it's reflecting sunlight. And so you will look and you will see a horizon between the light of the Earth and the darkness around it, and that horizon is circular. And if you think about it, the only way the horizon could look circular from whatever position you look at it is if the Earth is spherical, a solid sphere. If we're simply a round disk, if you look at it straight from the top, it would look circular. But the more you move downwards, the more it would look simply like an ellipse getting thinner and thinner and thinner. At the edge, it would look just like a straight line. So if there's a circular horizon, it's telling us that the Earth is a sphere. And so that description then in Job 26:10 is exactly accurate. And of course, no one in Job's day had gone out into space and looked at the Earth from there to see this. So again, we have to ask, how did the writer know? But of course, God did know all along. He made the Earth.
That is fascinating. But I've heard some people say that this is nullified by what comes in the next verse, verse 11, which speaks of the pillars of heaven. Does that not mean that the writer did think that the heavens were being held up on solid supports, which would be a clear error?
No, it really doesn't mean that. That challenge assumes that the pillars referred to here in verse 11 are some sort of upright, solid supporting structures. And yes, the word pillar is sometimes used that way in the Bible. For example, in Genesis 31:45, where we read, "So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar." Now, if that's the only way the word were used in the Bible, then it would be a problem. But pillar, you'll see, is frequently used in another way, as in these examples. Exodus 13:21. "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light." Exodus 14:24. "Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud." Joel 2:30. "And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke."
So what kinds of pillars are those then?
Well, in the context, you can see that in these cases, the meaning of pillar is some sort of roughly vertical column of particular matter with gases. Fire, smoke, flame, cloud. These are not solid supporting structures at all. They're pillars in the sense of the shape, but they're made of, as I say, particulate matter and or gases. So the question then, when we're looking at Job 26:11, when this challenge is brought that it speaks of pillars here, the question is, are there actually pillars of the second sort, roughly vertical columns of particulate matter, gases? Do they exist somewhere in the heavens, in outer space? And to our surprise, the answer is yes. They're actually called nebulae. That's the correct name for them. They're gigantic towers of cosmic gas and dust. And you can look them up if you want. It's easy to find pictures to see what they look like. Perhaps the most famous is the Eagle Nebula, which has been dubbed by NASA, calls it the Pillars of Creation. There's another called the Black Pillar. There's one called the Cone Nebula. They're amazing in size. Some of these are like 9.5 light years in height. Because as you started, say, shine a flashlight from one end, it would be 9.5 years before I got at the other end and actually saw the light from it. Even though light travels so quickly, 2.9979 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. So there are indeed pillars in the heavens. Pillars exactly in the way it's used in Exodus 13, Exodus 14, Joel 2:30, and elsewhere. But, and here's the interesting thing again, these pillars could not have been seen in Job's time. These, again, are things that require telescopes to see them. Nebulae were not even observed at all until the 18th century AD. These particularly impressive ones were not until the 20th century. So the question then, again, how could the writer know that there were pillars in heaven? How would he know to put this detail into his account unless it was breathed to him by God? So when the skeptics try to use the mention of pillars here to discredit the Bible, it actually backfires on them, because it turns out to be the third example of advanced scientific knowledge in this chapter alone.
Ah, that is fascinating. You said third example, so is there yet another one?
There's a third example in chapter 26 of Job. Example number 1, the earth hanging on nothing. Number 2, the circular horizon. And number 3, the pillars in heaven. But in point of fact, we do have other examples of advanced scientific knowledge. Here's one, and that is that the Bible, that again, it will seem obvious to you. You wouldn't give it a second thought when you read it. But the Bible treats the number of stars as something so huge that it is absolutely uncountable. And that's mentioned many times in the Bible. For example, Genesis 15:5, God is speaking to Abram. Then he brought him outside and said, "Look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." In Jeremiah 33:22, we read, "As the hosts of heaven cannot be numbered, nor the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the descendants of David my servant and the Levites who minister to me." Hebrews 11:12, we read, "Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore." What's interesting here is not only does the Bible say that the number of stars is huge, but it is so huge you can't can't count it. It will be like trying to count the number of grains of sand by the seashore.
Well, that's kind of obvious. I mean, we all know that the number of stars is so huge that you can't even count it.
Well, yes, that's what we think. That's why when we read these things, we don't give it a second thought, because it is obvious to us. How many stars are there out there? Nobody knows, but there's estimates up to like 300 sextillion stars. What's a sextillion? Well, you take 1,000,000 and multiply that by 1,000, you get 1,000,000,000. Multiply it by another 1,000, you're up to trillion. Multiply it by another 1,000, you're up to quadrillion. Another 1,000, you're up to quintillion. And then another 1,000 before you get to sextillion. So 300 sextillion stars, completely uncountable. Completely so. If you were to try to count to 1,000,000, try to count up to 1,000,000 at a rate of 1 per second, and you're doing it for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would take you over 5 days to count to 1,000,000. But to count to 1,000,000,000, it would take you over 31 years.
Oh.
So these numbers are certainly uncountable. And we think, yes, that's obvious. That's why we don't give these verses a second glance. What we overlook, though, is that most of those stars out there can't be seen. Can't be seen by the naked eye. We look up at the sky and sure, we can see a bunch of stars, but the thing is we can count. We can. The ancients did count the number of stars, and you know what? It wasn't such a huge number. Hipparchus, back in the 2nd century BC, counted and said there were 1,022 stars. Ptolemy, in the AD 90 to 168, Ptolemy counted 1,056. Tycho Brahe, 1546 to 1601. Some of you might have remembered him from high school physics. He's the fellow who did all those astronomical observations on which Kepler based his laws. He counted 777. And then Kepler himself, the fellow who discovered the laws of planetary motion, said there were 1,005. So you look up at the stars, you can count them, and you know what? It's not such an impressive number. There were kings in the ancient world who had armies 100 times that size, more than 100 times that size. It just wasn't that impressive. It almost would be like saying, oh, really? You're going to give me that many descendants? You give me the number of descendants like the fingers on one hand? It just wasn't that impressive. But the Bible always teaches it as impressive, as if there's so many. And for time, it might seem, well, that doesn't make sense. And then we invented telescopes. And with the telescopes, we looked out and suddenly we saw, you know what, there's a whole bunch of stars out there that we couldn't see with the naked eye. A lot of stars out there we didn't know about. And it's not intuitively obvious that there are stars there that you can't see. People all looked up, they counted the stars, and they thought, yeah, what you see is what there is. There's no reason to imagine that there were more than that. And yet there are. And there are billions and trillions and quadrillions of stars. So once again, we have to ask, how is it that the Bible throughout uses the number of stars as something so huge it's uncountable when nobody else at that time thought it was all that huge or thought that it was uncountable? Once again, we have to ask, how did this kind of information get into the Bible unless there's a divine hand behind its production?
There couldn't be a way for them to know. So
Exactly.
I did have to do it.
Exactly.
Oh, so I was wondering if there's yet another example. Just wondering.
There are quite a number of them. We'll go through one or two more. This one, for example, is a little more subtle to see, okay? But you can see it. What you have to do is if you go back to the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and most of you can probably recite it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashmayim va'et haaretz. You see that the word for created, right at the very beginning there, is the Hebrew word bara. That's a very interesting word, and it shows up 3 times in Genesis chapter 1. You don't see it again until verse 21, and then you'll see it again later on in verse 26, 27. About this account of creation, God does this bara at the beginning of the account. And then he doesn't do a bara again. What he does is he will do asai, atzar. He'll take the material that he made in verse 1 and he will reshape it and reform it. Let there be light, and there is light. God separates the dry land from the water and so on. It's all working with the stuff he made in verse 1. You don't see a bara again until you get to verse 21, where God makes living creatures. And then you'll see it again when he makes man. Now, what's the significance of this? This word bara in the Bible is not used of any human action. It's something that God does, and only God can do, which indicates that it's a miraculous act. If we look at the other word used, where God does things, the word asa, that implies or means actually taking stuff that's already there and simply reshaping it or reforming it. For example, if I had a pile of boards and bricks and glass, windows, tiles, and so on, I could make it into a house. People can do that. It's used of people all the time. But this bara is special. It's used only of God's act, God's action. And so it implies doing something completely new, bringing into existence something out of nothing, something that did not exist in any form before, what we call ex nihilo, out of nothing. And the interesting thing is the beginning of the account, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Well, the indication there, unlike pagan mythologies, is that there was no heavens and earth until God brought them into being out of nothing. Heavens and earth is a Hebrew merism, meaning everything. So all of the matter, energy out of which the world is made, God brought into being right there. And it had to have been done through a bara act, a miraculous act. And then it's like reshaping, reforming, let there be, and so on. You don't get another bara until, as I said, verse 21, where he makes the living creatures.
So what's the significance of that?
The significance of that is there are two fundamental laws of science implied right within Genesis chapter 1. Why a bara for bringing the heavens and the earth, all of the matter, energy of the universe into being from nothing? Well, science has discovered various laws. Scientists have discovered various laws. Most fundamental are the laws of thermodynamics. And the first law of thermodynamics, enunciated by Hermann Helmholtz in 1847, is also known as the law of conservation of matter energy. And it states that matter energy cannot be created or destroyed by any natural process, but only changed from one form to another. What that would mean is to bring matter energy out of nothing, to bring it into existence, would require a miracle. It would require a bara act. It could not be done through asa, because that's changing something that's already there into something else. Now, we know now that matter energy cannot come into being from nothing. You cannot ever create matter by any natural process out of nothing. Now, for God to create the heavens and the earth, it had to have come out of nothing. How did the writer know that to bring matter energy into being would require a bara act? Why not asa?
Because there was nothing there to start with. I mean, he wasn't just reshaping, reforming existing materials like it would be with asa.
Yes, and to bring matter energy out of nothing is impossible by any natural process, but we didn't know that. Not at the time the Bible was written. We didn't know that completely until Helmholtz in 1847. And then particularly significant as well is that there is a second bara, and that comes in verse 21, and that's where he creates life. In verse 1, he created matter and energy, and then he reshaped that, reformed that, built it into this entire planet we live on, but there's no living thing there. Then he brings life. He creates living creatures. And here again, the word used is bara. And the question is why? Because people thought for centuries and centuries that life is just spontaneously generated out of matter. Matter just naturally comes to life, called, as I said, spontaneous generation. And so why would you need a special act, a bara, to bring life into being if life just comes naturally out of non-living material? And it was not until 1864, by the work of several scientists, culminating with Louis Pasteur, that we discovered that no, life cannot come out of non-living matter. Spontaneous generation is impossible. Life can only come from life, can never come from non-living matter. And so when God made the earth and he shaped it, there's no life there. So once he's built this habitation to bring life into it, he needs to create it anew. He needs a bara act. Now, people didn't know that. Not until 1864. To that point, they thought, could just come out of already existing matter. Then we discovered, no, it can't. And yet there it is in Genesis chapter 1. From the very beginning, the writers knew that life cannot just come out of matter. It requires a miracle from God. How did they know that? How did they know what modern science didn't discover until the 19th century? Once again, unless the hand of God is behind it.
Oh, that's amazing. It's like boggles the mind. Isn't there a third time that the that bara is used?
There is, and that's when man is made. And this is why the Bible describes man as a tripartite being: body, soul, and spirit. And if we see the soul as the life force, or you can see spirit as life force, something that's purely matter, like this table here or a rock, has only matter. It's unipartite. Animals are bipartite. Like your dog has matter, it's got a material body, and also has a life force in it. Human beings, though, are different from that because we have three parts, three components. We have the material body, like the table and like the dog. We have the life force, which the table doesn't have, but the dog does. We also have this third element, this spirit in us, this tertium quid. It's the spirit in us that makes us able to worship, able to know God, morally accountable, creative, and so on. It makes us fundamentally different from animals. So despite the claims of atheistic scientists, we're not animals. Human beings are fundamentally different and discontinuous with animals because of that third element. Now the Bible knew that, but no scientific law has yet been discovered, so there's not much more to say about that other than that we will discover that fact, that we are in fact discontinuous with animals. But there's another description of a scientific law in the Bible, and for that you will turn to for example, Psalm 102, verses 25 to 27, where we read, "Of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will endure. Yes, they will all grow old like a garment. Like a cloak you will change them, and they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will have no end." And we see the same kind of idea in Isaiah 51:6. "Lift up your eyes to the heavens, and look on the earth beneath, for the heavens will vanish away like smoke, the earth will grow old like a garment, and those who dwell in it will die in like manner. But my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will not be abolished." Well, what's significant in these passages? The heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish. They will grow old like a garment. You will change them. They will be changed. In Isaiah 51, the heavens will vanish away. The earth will grow old like a garment. Now, what's interesting about that is it's true. Everything in the entire universe is winding down. Everything in the universe is collapsing into disorder, slowly, perhaps, but it's happening. And scientists today tell us that the entire universe is headed to what they call heat death, where the disintegration becomes complete and all life, all process becomes impossible. But it's not something you can look at. The idea that this world we live in will end, will grow old like people, again, not something intuitively obvious. We know that people go through the cycle where people are born, and they grow up, and then they grow old, and they die, and there's a new generation that grows up, gets old, and dies. People do this, but not the world. The idea that the world somehow is growing old, that the world itself is running down, collapsing, going into disorder, falling apart to the point where it will essentially die, was not something that anybody knew or guessed or had any reason to imagine would happen. They thought it was just going on and on and on, and the earth will keep going, the world will keep going. People in it grow old and die, but the world doesn't. And yet here in Psalm 102 and Isaiah 51 and elsewhere is this concept that yes, the entire world is becoming old, and it will be changed, and it will come to an end. And this fact that things are growing old, things are going into disorder, things are falling apart, is what is enunciated in the second law of thermodynamics, which is considered the most fundamental law of science, enunciated by Rudolf Clausius in 1850. The most fundamental law of science. You see that right in there in the Old Testament, something that people had no way of knowing, that modern science didn't discover until the mid-19th century, and yet it was there all along. And so once again, we have to point out that there are things there that could not have gotten in by solely human effort. There's no way they knew it. And so once again, we have to ask, how did they get in there if there was no divine hand behind the Bible?
Yeah, I can see why this is so significant, because you're right, we don't notice them. but clearly they could not have gotten into the Bible without some divine help, without God actually breathing these things in. People simply could not have come up with these on their own.
Yes, and I would say these, like fulfilled prophecy, these stand as clear evidence that the Bible is indeed from God, that it is the word from God, and that we need to take it seriously, because there is no other book like that out there, no other book that authenticates itself as being the Word of God.
Oh, this was a very fascinating session. There are just all sorts of things that are very, very cool there. Anyway, we're glad to have you yet again, and I look forward to what we're going to be doing next time.
Thank you.
If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.